When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
you die. There is no middle ground.
Welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be talking about the Melisandre Fingerbone Theory revolving around Davos's lost luck and or his fingerbones that were taken from him by Stannis. Now, this is a theory I haven't covered on the channel at all. I've wanted to cover it in the past, I just never got to it, or other ideas sprang in my mind. And as I was planning out my content for the rest of the year, this is one that came up as I need to finally look at this theory. And this is not a popular theory from what I've seen. I've only really seen one video that somebody talked about this theory in depthly. I don't know if it's been mentioned in like bigger live streams or bigger talking points. The only person I saw make a video on this was Quinn, the GM. So we'll talk about some of his conclusions at the end when we get towards what I believe could be going on with Davos's fingerbones. But I did want to point that out. This is not really a popular theory in the community, and I couldn't find much in this theory in terms of going on the usual places, YouTube, Reddit, the World of Ice and Fire, like wiki page, forum page. So this is a theory that I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on, and let's get into the video. So a bit of a recap. So Davos in book 2 specifically, and also book 3, thinks about his fingerbones, and then also like kind of fiddles with them, especially in book 2, as they are what he deems to be his luck. It reminds him of his past and the person that he's become, from going from a smuggler to being, well, a knight, somebody within the household of Stannis, given a lot more power, and his children having a far better life because of what he did at Storm's End all those years ago. And so they're put a lot of emphasis on for Davos's character. But unfortunately, during the Battle of the Blackwater, he loses his luck, and that's kind of also symbolized in the way that they lose the Battle of the Blackwater. Davos's luck has finally turned. Stannis' cause is kind of flailing. Stannis has very little men, he has almost no support, and also you have Joffrey and Margaery getting married. It seems like the power is completely in Tywin's hands. But some of that seems to flip. Stannis has a great victory in the north against the wildlings, but there is this lingering idea that we get brought up in Dance with Dragons of Davos's fingerbones, because it would seem that they just were lost to the sea, or maybe the wildfire burned his fingerbones. But then we get a very interesting quote by Melisandre in her only chapter in the series. So this comes after we've seen the fake Mance being burned, aka Rattleshirt, and that we get this reveal that Mance is still alive. But this quote is very interesting in terms of how glamours work, and a specific reference to a bag of fingerbones. So here's the quote. "The bones help," said Melisandre, "the bones remember. The strongest glamours are built of such things, a dead man's boots, a hank of hair, a bag of fingerbones with whispered words and prayer. A man's shadow can be drawn forth from such and draped about another like a cloak. The wearer's essence does not change, only his seeming." So this is really interesting because a bag of fingerbones directly applies to Davos. And so there's really a couple thought processes you have to have here. Is this just a reference because it's something that sticks out to Melisandre? She knows Davos quite well, and this bag of fingerbones is something very significant to his character. Or is it more to it? And for me, I personally think there has to be more to it, just based on the fact that Melisandre references such a specific thing about Davos, especially in terms of glamouring. So the issue you have with this theory, and I think this is the biggest issue really, is how would she have gotten Davos's fingerbones? The only way that this seems possible is either one, she somehow stole his fingerbones before he went to the Battle of the Blackwater. But how did she do this? Did she just do a swap? So another bag of something was put with Davos. Why would Melisandre do this? Was she given some sort of vision of that these fingerbones would be relevant? Was it the idea that possibly Melisandre was given the fingerbones because of the wildfire? Maybe the Lord of Light brought her these fingerbones. Maybe the idea could be that the fingerbones were found by someone, maybe during or after the battle, and that was given to Melisandre. Maybe that's why everybody assumed he was dead. I think the biggest issue and stretch of this theory is just the idea of how Melisandre would have gotten them. Or even if she didn't get them, is this supposed to be some sort of reference that she's going to try and glamour as Davos, or have somebody else glamour as Davos in the future? That's a little bit of what we just don't really know. There's a lot of gray area in this theory, but I think it's something that George leaves quite open-ended. But it is even more interesting because given Mel later says in A Storm of Swords that Davos has a role to play for the Lord of Light. Now, I think on our reads, we look at this and go, well, yeah, Davos has a role to play in terms of backing Stannis' cause. If he is Azor Ahai, well, of course, Davos would be a useful tool in helping him get the throne. And we know that to be the case. But is there more than just that? Has Melisandre seen something, using Davos in some regard? Either way, for the idea of this theory, let's say that she has the fingerbones. What does she need them for? That's the next question. Well, by the end of A Dance with Dragons, Jon Snow is allegedly dead. That's another theory I want to talk about at some point, the idea, did Jon Snow actually die? But let's just assume he's dead, and Stannis is said to be dead because of the pink letter. So at this point, Melisandre has really nobody to back. Jon, who she had been growing closer to, has suddenly died, and Stannis is also allegedly dead. And the other issue is that Melisandre can't see Stannis in the flames. Every time she looks for Stannis or Azor Ahai, she sees, snow, and that's kind of to represent that Jon might be Azor Ahai, or at least part of that prophecy. But either way, Mela's connection with Stannis seems to be wavering. So this gets to a very interesting point. Kind of like in the show, Melisandre might be wavering in her faith. Everything that she believed has kind of come crashing down. Jon is dead, Stannis is dead. She might be very desperate, and that might lead her to do some drastic actions. And we know that King's blood is the main thing that Melisandre goes after that has true power. The issue is we've kind of seen that be not the case, just given the fact that Mance was not burned, Rattleshirt was not a king. He didn't have King's blood either. And so we've seen that it's not necessarily King's blood, it's really just blood sacrifices in general have power. That can breed life. But if we're going off the idea that it has to be King's blood, what Melisandre has kind of been showing Stannis, well, the only King's blood near her is Shireen. Now you could also go with the idea that Mance's child, but remember that was switched with Gilly. Now, Jon is really the only person that knows that at this moment, so could this baby be killed regardless? It's possible. If Jon's not there to say, oh, this child is not actually Mance's child, who knows, the child could be killed. But the other one, and the more important one, given we've had George saying that Stannis will burn Shireen, is that Shireen is nearby. And so many people have believed that Shireen's death will somehow be important to bringing Jon back, just given the fact that we have the idea that death can pay for life. That is really the only way. But the issue with Jon is his circumstance is so much different. Whereas a character like Catelyn, for instance, she doesn't warg into any other creatures, not living into something else. She gets brought back as like a zombie version of herself. Jon is different in the way of, for one, he's going to be warged inside of Ghost, so his spirit more or less seems like it will still be intact. Not to say that won't change him at all, but for the most part, it'll be very different if there's a resurrection with Jon than it would be for basically any other character in the series. But, again, not everybody is going to know that. But the issue is, if you believe Shireen is going to be burned so that Jon can come back, that's going to have to come way later in the book, given the fact that Stannis is supposed to burn her. Well, Stannis, remember, he's in the middle of a battle for getting Winterfell, and we know the whole first third of the book is probably going to be surrounding the build-up more or less to the Battle of Ice, the Battle of Ice happening. What does Stannis do after that point if he's still alive? If he wins the Battle of Ice, how does he then take Winterfell? Does he take Winterfell at all? Does he go back to the Wall? The issue is you run into the point of Stannis and Shireen will not be really united until much later in the book. And so does that mean Jon is going to stay dead for predominantly most of the Winds of Winter? That's the issue you run into. And so I do want to put up what Quinn believed. So Quinn believed this idea that Mel is going to glamour as Davos and order her to be burned. But that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you think about the idea of Stannis is going to burn Shireen, because in this situation, it would be that Davos, as Hand of the King, would be saying these are Stannis' orders, but they actually aren't, and especially because Mel is the one being glamoured, and Mel is the one, glamouring this, so it's all fake. So then Shireen is burned on those orders. But the problem is Stannis isn't involved with that at all, and so is it the idea that Stannis is directly going to order Shireen to be killed, or is there some kind of asterisk next to it that people believe Stannis ordered it, but Stannis didn't? That's the biggest issue you run into with this theory. And so I think, just to play it safe, if we're looking at the idea of Shireen's death, I believe Stannis has to be involved in some way, or I don't think George would have said it just as bluntly that Stannis is going to burn Shireen. So I think the idea that could make a ton of sense is that Mel does glamour as Davos, like Quinn said. But then Stannis, maybe after his whole Bolton conflict, going back to the wall to defend the wall from the others, maybe Euron has blown the Horn of Winter and the wall is starting to come down. Who knows? Stannis might be in a very desperate position. He doesn't have the North all rallied underneath him. They don't have the men to fight off the others. And so Mel glamours herself to look like Davos, the one person that Stannis trusts pretty much more than anyone, the person that he knows can always get good counsel from. And maybe Mel, as Davos, tells Stannis that the only way is for Shireen to be burned to fulfill kind of the Nissa side of the Azor Ahai prophecy that Stannis has to kill a loved one. Now, it's very different given it's somebody he was in love with, it's said for Azor Ahai, but he does love his daughter, so it could maybe fit that idea. So at this point, Shireen is burned, and that could fulfill that part of it. Now, the issue I really have and struggle with is I don't know how this makes sense if Jon is still dead. And so that might lead to there is some sort of other sacrifice or some sort of magic other than Shireen's death that will lead to Jon being resurrected and or put back into his actual body. So if this is the case, that Stannis then willingly orders Shireen's burning, but it's still trickery and confusion that Melisandre is what causes her to die. It would be even more tragic if we see Davos similar to a, Ned's death situation with Arya, where Arya is trying to get to her father, but she just can't. He's out of reach and she doesn't have the power to save him. It can be similar to that. Davos arrives just as Shireen is about to be burned. He is the real Davos, but he's too far away to do anything and watches Shireen die. I could see a situation like that. I think it would make sense as to why a character like Stannis, who has shown really no ability to especially burn his own daughter, he's very resilient, and even burning someone like Edric Storm, you think that he's actually going to burn Shireen, his own daughter, who he just sent away just in Massey to get a whole army for her. That's the main issue you run into with the character of Shireen dying, is that Stannis, at the end of A Dance with Dragons, there is no reasonable way as to why he would do that. And if you also even want to make this even more spooky, given the fact that Stannis wants to make his seat on the wall the Night Fort, it would also play into the cursed feeling of the Night Fort. So that is the theory, more or less. I think there's massive issues with everything around this theory based upon how could Melisandre get the fingerbones. Very unclear. There's not a whole lot of evidence to support that that is the case outside of one line that can be interpreted in multiple different ways. I then also think that the timing of Jon's quote-unquote resurrection and Shireen's death, with Stannis being involved, raises a huge red flag with how timing of events works. Maybe this is something George is struggling with. We don't know. But the thing I really point to in this theory is that I think it's really interesting. I think it would really help us understand why Stannis would burn Shireen, but it still has massive issues that George would definitely have to figure out, how does this make sense given what's been told in the story so far. But let me know what you guys think. I haven't heard much discourse on this theory on my research for it, and so I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. What do you think about the theory? If there's some more information, some more details you think would be relevant, I'd love to see them, as we may revisit this case at some point. Maybe in my 25 Days of Winds of Winter event in December, if there's a character in this area, we might talk about some parts of this theory again. But yeah, thank you guys all for watching. Subscribe if you enjoyed. And I also will say at the very end of this video, sorry for a lot of the videos. Probably the last week and this week are going to feel a lot more podcasty, not as much editing, not as much B-roll. As a lot of you probably know, I've been having issues with my back, and that does not allow me to sit down and edit these as much as I would like to, up to my standard. But I'm trying to do the best of uploading for you guys and still trying to get videos up. So a lot of these are going to feel a lot more unedited, a lot more of just, listening to them. You don't really need to see me. It's just, if you're in a car ride, just listening to my audio, that's kind of how a lot of these are meant to be anyway. But I hope you guys all enjoyed, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.